Thank you, Amelia, for that kind introduction. And thanks to Dylan Jordan for the invitation to participate both last year and this year, and for encouraging me to and allowing me to sort of revisit some of what I talked about last year in this year's talk, and to Maura for all the organizational work, and to all my co-participants from whom I'm learning a great deal here. All right, so I want to talk today about the problem of the Willicus, the enslaved overseer. And when I say problem, I mean a problem specifically within the kind of elite intellectual discourse that makes up, classical literature, and much of what we consider classical thought. And I should say I'm still, after a year and a half, figuring out what is the best way for me to speak over Zoom. And I'm not speaking from prepared remarks. I'm going to be speaking through a slide deck here, and I hope that's going to work all right. So at my talk last fall, I introduced what I am calling despotics. And despotics, in a nutshell, is the ancient intellectual and literary tradition that articulates strategies of domination and psychological violence to be inflicted on the enslaved by enslavers in the interest of increasing yield and preserving stability, and minimizing resistance, and therefore minimizing the use of what we might think of as physical violence. This is a part of what I tried to argue last year, is that this is a body of knowledge, an intellectualized body of knowledge that derives from real experiential knowledge of enslavers. So enslavers, ancient elite enslavers, is who I'm particularly interested in here, the class that basically makes up all of our authors of classical literature and all of our ancient thinkers. I'm positing that they, like enslavers and other slave societies, had real learned day-to-day experience of how to conduct the work of enslavement, and particularly how to practice the domination of the enslaved people who surrounded them. This is I'm deriving this insight from studies of enslavement of Africans and African Americans in the American and Caribbean worlds. Sometimes in the American South, this stuff is referred to as the arts of mastery, and there's a lot of literature about how particularly white children were kind of conditioned and taught to speak to African and African American people who they enslaved, what kind of responses to expect, and how to sort of daily practice the psychological violence that conditioned enslaved people to resist less, to comply more. And this is so I'm basically understanding this as a shared experience of enslavers in antiquity, and something that then informs a real concrete intellectualized tradition in ancient thought, which runs from Xenophon as our earliest example of it, through Columella and Brousson in the imperial period. This intellectualized tradition of despotics does two things. One, it articulates strategies for constraining and coercing the mental states of enslaved people, how to get them to think that resistance is futile, how to get them to think that they are less worthy or less valuable than those they enslave, that kind of thing. So the despotic tradition articulates that, and then it also articulates a kind of elite ideological apparatus to that, which says that this is good. It is good to practice psychological violence on enslaved people. And if you can do it well, that is both pleasurable to you as an elite enslaver and is a marker of your own elite virtue. So I think the best example of this is in Xenophon's Economicus. And in the final pages, he has the speaker Ischomachus articulate this vision of the enslaved workforce on the estate. And he imagines that the master, the enslaver, has appeared, the man who has the fullest power to punish the bad and reward the strenuous. I don't like strenuous. This is a lib translation. And he imagines that when the enslaver arrives, and then the whole enslaved workforce sort of works all the harder because they have seen their enslaver present. Well, this means that the enslaver has a touch of the kingly nature about him. So that if he maintains order and conditions his enslaved workforce in such a way that they work harder and seem to want to work harder. This is important to Xenophon, this kind of perception of voluntarism on the part of the enslaved workforce, that this is a reflection of the enslaver's elite virtue. And so this image of ephilanton arcane, rule over the willing, is kind of held up as the despotic ideal, the standard that you should aspire to as an enslaver. And that if you can achieve it, it actually reflects on your character in a positive way. So I want to make two distinctions here about the sort of the value of this discourse as evidence for us of the world of enslavement in antiquity. The fact that enslaved workers work harder and with less open resistance when the person who can punish them for not working is present is a kind of obvious fact of the way violence works in the workplace, right? And this is, I think we should register this as a learned fact from on the part of enslavers. If you are the person who could hurt people if they don't work and you stand there watching them, they're more likely to work. So this is one of these sort of like, thinking here about the subjectivity of the enslaver, this is something learned by experience from practicing enslavement. To then say, well, this is because I have elite virtue, I have a touch of the kingly, I have a good ethos, that is the ideological scaffolding that is attached to these experiential sort of day-to-day kind of bloody realities of the practice of enslavement by the despotic tradition. So that's sort of the context for what I'm going to try to talk about here. There's probably no like more unreliable and unhelpful, I think, source for thinking about slavery in antiquity than Aristotle, who unfortunately often gets pride of place because he's like pretty early and he says these big dramatic things in politics, one about what a slave is or isn't. But you know, he has a real kind of specific concrete philosophical agenda in politics, one that he's constantly trying to cram slavery as a historical reality into, and it often involves sort of leaving out or obscuring or eliding things that we might think of as relevant to the kind of pursuit of real historical knowledge. In Politics 1, when he's thinking through different analogies for the polis, and he's sort of thinking about masters and slaves and trying to figure out what distinguishes masters and slaves, he gets this question of whether they're distinguished by epistemi. Are masters and slaves different because they know different things? And he says, well, it doesn't really seem like there is kind of one concrete slave episteme. And he says, if there is a despotike episteme, a kind of knowledge that is characteristic of and definitional of enslavers, it's really just how to manage enslaved people. But he says that's actually a science with no particular importance or dignity. He says all people rich enough to avoid this kind of trouble have a steward or overseer who does it for them, and they can get back to politics or philosophy. And I think what's important about this is that it shows that there is this, the way that overseers are kind of grit in the lubrication of the otherwise finely functioning intellectual machine of ancient philosophy that so often turns to and considers slavery kind of as an abstract or as a hypothetical, in a way that really divorces it from what we might think of as a historical reality. Ancient philosophical paradigms, ancient ideological paradigms really liked the idea of a hard binary between enslaver and enslaved. And we can see this binary being enshrined in all kinds of institutions and practices. But the problem is that the actual practice of enslavement and the extraction of enslaved labor at scale often depended on enslaved overseers. So you have on the one hand this binary, and on the other hand this sort of real life practice in which if you have more than one or two enslaved people working and you can't watch them all the time, you have an enslaved overseer who watches them for you. And the problem that results from this is that it relates to despotic ideology. So if it is the case that successfully controlling enslaved people through like manipulation or rule is characteristic of the elite enslaving class, then it is a problem that we have enslaved overseers who in actual fact have to do that work themselves, right? And this becomes particularly acute in the Roman imagination with the rise of, you know, what we might term loosely kind of like absentee elite villa culture, right? So the Roman despotic tradition begins with Cato, the earliest surviving Latin prose, which, as it's been noted, Cato Cato finds let's say it this way, through Cato, we find Roman agriculture already having been transformed substantially by the mass importation of human cargo after the Roman wars of expansion and conquest, and the sort of buying up of land by Italy's and Rome's elite to create these larger and larger plantations to be worked by larger and larger enslaved workforces under the supervision of vilici in the absence of the dominus or the paterfamilias, the enslaver. So you have this problem, right? In practical fact, the overseer needs to do some of the work of the enslaver that the enslaver would really like to think is kind of what characterizes him exclusively. So Cato doesn't have much to say about the management of enslaved people that is not entangled with the management of the vilices. This is early on in the De Re Cultura. And I've cut out a lot of his instructions about the overseer here, but I want to focus on two things that he says. First, he says that the overseer must not think that he knows more than the master. And then he explains all these things that the overseer has to do as a proxy for the master that are to be constrained by the overseer's subsidiary nature, right? So any business that the vilicus is involved in that reflects on the dominus as a business actor or a social actor, relationships with social peers, friends, making loans, this kind of thing. In all of those, the vilicus can only do what the dominus tells him to, and should only do it with the knowledge of the dominus. But then later he says, well, the vilicus must see to it that he knows how to perform all the operations of the farm and to see that he actually does them. And then he'll know what's in the mind of all the workers. And then the workers will obey him better because they see him doing the same work that they're doing. And what's significant here is, if we were to just read this in English translation, we would register immediately a kind of contradiction that the vilicus knows how to do every single thing on the farm, and yet he is not he's not supposed to think that he knows more than the master does. Now, the first thing to note about this is that when Cato says the vilicus must not think he knows more than the master, this is despotics, because this is attempting to litigate and restrict the mental state and the self-perception of the overseer. Now, just as an important footnote here is to say that this entire despotic tradition I'm talking about of controlling and coercing the mental states of enslaved people, this is really what Scott calls the public transcript. And many times it starts to look like an enslaver fantasy, that such control over enslaved people's mental states is possible. So I just want to acknowledge here that what we're talking about here is a kind of enslaver fantasy of the extent to which it's possible to control people's mental states, and also acknowledge the fact that this kind of discourse and this kind of writing also serves as a guide to enslaved people of how enslavers' kind of needs and desires from their exertion of power might be kind of manipulated or controlled in turn. So Cato says, well, the vilicus shouldn't think he knows more than the master. And Pliny, actually, like centuries later, will say, well, the overseer, the vilicus, should be as near in character or intellect to the enslaver, but should not seem so himself. So right from the beginning and on for centuries in Roman thought about this, there's a real concern about the overseer thinking he knows more than the master. And that knowing is articulated with one of several verbs Latin has for knowing, sapere. And sapere, of course, is the verb from which we get sapiens, right, which is Latin's word for kind of the good man in Latin philosophy. And here I think Cato is using it to signify kind of elite enslaver knowledge. This is in contrast with sentire, which is the word for the kind of knowing the vilicus does when he knows how to do things on the farm. And so this is what I've referred to as the epistemic firewall, that Cato is here trying to erect some fundamental distinctions between the kinds of knowing that define enslavers and the kinds of knowing that define the enslaved, even the most powerful among the enslaved. And in this, I'm in part informed by Danel's work on religion and religious restriction in Cato, where he talks about the religious restrictions as being part of this larger program of enforcing ontological distinctions onto enslaved people. So this epistemic firewall can be found throughout Roman elite enslaver thought. Seneca, in his 90th moral epistle, has this long section where he's arguing with Posidonius about where human inventions came from among the earliest human beings. And Posidonius says, well, the earliest kind of inventions and useful discoveries were found by the earliest wise men, the sapientes among early humans. And Seneca says, no, 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 no. He says it was ingenuity, it was not wisdom that discovered inventions and tools. And he goes on in a passage I've left out here to say that tools were simply discovered by the people who do the kind of work that needs tools. In our own times, he says, which man do you deem the wiser? The one who invents a process for spraying saffron perfume to a tremendous height from hidden pipes, who fills or empties canals by sudden rushes of waters, who cleverly constructs a dining room with movable panels. Is that the wise man, or is the wise man the one who tells you that you can live without such luxuries? You can live without marble cutters. You can live without engineers and builders. Follow nature, he says, and you have no need for skilled craftsmen. Now, in one way, this is just a kind of stock Roman sort of moral warning against luxury, right? But I think it's interesting how it reflects in particular the Roman elite's dependence day to day on and really being surrounded by highly skilled labor done by people who were largely low status or enslaved. Right. And it's, I think, striking here that Seneca, using terms familiar from Cato, is working really hard to insist that all these people who know how to build way more elaborate machines than Seneca himself ever would, whatever is going on in their heads, it's not wisdom, right? He's attempting to reclassify this kind of knowledge on which he and his peers depend, right? We're trying to reclass this as kind of ontologically servile. Right, that this kind of knowledge is fundamentally, not only is it not wisdom, it is characteristic of and exclusive to a kind of inferior class of human. But Philodemus's treatise on household management is a really interesting wrinkle in the despotic tradition. He really pushes back on a lot of the things that the kind of Xenophontic despotics say, and one of them has to do with the question of overseers. So Philodemus, in distinction from the other despotic writers, is really concerned with the good man, not just, so Xenophon takes it as read that the good oikonomos will be kalos kagathos. Philodemus is not content with this. And he says, listen, there's a difference between being a really effective manager of a profitable estate and being a good man, right? Being a sage in the philosophical sense. And he says that actually the problem is that to be really good at running an estate and making money is a moral hazard. There is an imperial practice and ability, especially related to money making, he says, of which a good man will not have a share. These things characterize the person who loves money, who is philokrematos. So it's not disagreeable, he says, that there should be someone of this kind in the role of a servant or a slave. So Philodemus, looking at the configuration of elite households with enslaved overseers, tasks the enslaved overseer with all of the aspects of kind of labor management and business management that increase yield and preserve stability on the estate, insulates the enslaver as the kind of aspiring sage from the moral hazard of being good at those things. And so by defining excellence at the logistics, the day-to-day of household management as morally hazardous, he also conditions the overseer as being fundamentally inferior, damaged, and tainted. So the very things that the overseer has to be good at to fulfill the function that he serves also render him kind of morally damaged. They wall him off from access to the true elite kind of goodness or sageliness. Columella is kind of all in on the Catonian model here. The beginning of his agricultural treatise, he says that the reason for declining Roman agricultural yield is not climate change or soil exhaustion. He says it's because we've handed our agriculture over to our slaves. And if you're not clear what he means by that, he makes it explicit. He says it's an old thing of Cato that the land is grievously maltreated when the dominus listens to the villicus about what should happen on the farm rather than telling the villicus what to do. Note that there's not an insistence here that the villicus can't run the farm. Rather, there's an insistence that it is fundamentally damaging to the land if the villicus is allowed to run the farm. And I think that what this is getting at, and this idea is articulated in Varro as well, is that if the enslaver yields any of his executive authority to the villicus by not directing him at all times, even though the villicus doesn't really need that direction, this is a threat to the stability of the entire kind of order of labor on the enslaved villa. So this kind of despotic control starts at the top, and it's implicitly threatened by the sort of reality that these farms only run by the vilici knowing how to run them without supervision and doing that most of the time, right? When Columella talks about this stuff, he's clearly talking about farms, but I think one of the important things to remember is that by the time that Columella is writing, we have the title villicus attested in inscriptions all over the city of Rome and elsewhere for all sorts of other kinds of work, both in private houses, the Familia Caesaris, and among public slaves. And this is just an example of some of the ones that are attested in inscriptions. My favorite one here is villicus anatocissimi, which I think is the villicus of compound interest. So it's clearly a word that derived from villiculture labor configurations comes to stand for all of the contexts in which Roman elites and elite power structures depended on enslaved overseers who supervised other enslaved workforces, largely without direct supervision themselves. And this question of how, to what extent they served as proxies for the enslaver, and what hazards or risks that introduces, whether for the stability of order or simply for the enslaver's ego. These questions are raised by Columella, but I think he cannot just be thinking about the farm. And indeed, once you sort of relax the verbal specificity here and think about other categories of overseer or manager, like actor, procurator, these are also widely attested. We have just tons and tons of configurations where Rome's enslaving elite by the 1st, 2nd century CE are really dependent on figures like this. And I think that Columella's attention to it has to relate to that, not just to agricultural context per se. So in my remaining 10 minutes or so, I want to just connect this question of the kind of epistemic firewall, the practice in the epistemological realm of these imposition of ontological distinctions. I want to connect this specifically to the question of literary work. Amelia alluded to the book I'm trying to write right now on this, which is indeed what sort of sent me down the alleyway of being interested in this material and these questions. Varro, in his agricultural work, when he's recommending qualifications for enslaved overseers, he doesn't use the word villicus. He talks about qui praesunt or praefecti, those who are in charge, the prefects. He says that one qualification for an enslaved boss is that they have like a little bit of literacy. He uses the word imbuti, which I'm struggling to translate in this context. You know, in English, imbue often has the sense of being deeply instilled in some way. But it seems pretty clear in context that Varro is talking about just kind of people who've dipped their toes into literate education. And this gives them access to kind of bookkeeping. Varro also has this idea that like the head shepherd should carry around a book of Mago on sheep diseases with him. It's not clear to what extent Varro is sort of fantasizing here, but Varro's model is clearly that there is a certain amount of literate skill and literate knowledge in farm work that the bosses should have access to. And that doesn't mean that they need to be fully kind of pepaidumenos, but it means that they need to have kind of dipped their toes into literacy. This word, this idea of being imbuti, of kind of being dipped into paidutic skill, is also the word used by Aulus Gellius a couple centuries later in this story about Plutarch beating someone enslaved in his household. So we don't hear why this enslaved person is being beaten, but we hear that he is, he's worthless, he's a nequam, he's a contumax. His ears have been dipped in something, the books and disputations of philosophy. So this is an enslaved person in the house of Plutarch, which means that he is on a daily basis overhearing conversations about philosophy or the reading or dictation of philosophical books. So he is to be beaten, and there he is being beaten, and he's sort of proclaiming his innocence, and then he says to Plutarch, like, you shouldn't be doing this. It's not seemly for a philosopher to be angry like this. You wrote a whole book about not being angry. And Plutarch, I haven't given you this whole part of the story, but Plutarch then responds, says, do I look angry to you? And then Plutarch summarizes his thesis on anger, that anger has all these physical symptoms, which he himself is not showing. And then there ends a sort of punchline about how the beatings will just continue. And the sort of implication of this, I think clearly, is that this enslaved person has overheard books. He's been in the room when books have been read, but he lacks a fundamental understanding of the true philosophical concepts that are at stake here. I think this is an example of what this kind of epistemic firewall looks like in practice around literate skill, right? In the houses of Rome's, intellectual enslaving elite, books are being read in the presence of enslaved people all the time. But here's a very clear paradigm under which they're not the readers in the room, right? So if you imagine even a social reading scene, you have like 10 Roman senators, an enslaved lector reading to them, and then waiters. If we were to ask, well, who are the readers in this scene? All the influence of Roman thought and about reading and social configurations would lead us to say, well, it's the senators who are the readers because they're being read to, and the waiters who are passing through, they don't get to count as readers. And I think that's because of this in the Roman view, because of this ontological distinction. But it's also meant to sort of wall enslaved people off from access to paideutic activity. Now, this is, I think, even more acute. More acutely related to the problem of the overseer when we think about literary works, so the creation of literature. I've just given you a few examples here of this fundamental phenomenon of Romans talking about the writing and creation of literature, in which, although we know that Roman elite authors depended widely on enslaved secretaries and scribes, there is a clear distinction in their accounts of their own modes of working between the use of enslaved secretaries as kind of tools or prosthetics or parts of their own body. So Martial talks about his enslaved secretary as his faithful right hand. There's a clear distinction between that and their foregrounding, as Pliny does, of the deep involvement that their peers and friends have in the creation and revision of literature in terms of its ideas and its execution. So, in other words, Roman authors are using enslaved secretaries all the time, but they're only collaborators in the sense that we would mean that word. The only people who are recognized to have an influence on the creation of the work qua literary work or qua intellectual work are fellow members of the elite enslaving class. This is, I think, part of the problem that Tullius Tiro poses for Aulus Gellius. And in my Gellius book, I said, listen, Gellius is mad because Tiro is a slave, but he writes his own books. I actually think now it's a little more complicated than that. Going back and looking at how Gellius describes Tullius Tiro, whom he understands to have been kind of an amanuensis, a collaborator, a reviser of Cicero's books, Gellius doesn't have a word for this. And I've given you here all the different words he kind of fumbles through as he's trying to characterize the relationship between Tullius Tiro. And I would actually suggest now that part of what's going on for Gellius is that on the one hand, he has an idea, perhaps as a result of reading Cicero ad Fam 16, that Tiro was somehow involved in the Ciceronian literary and intellectual project, but he also doesn't have a mental category in which an enslaved person could actually have that role, or even a formerly enslaved person in this case. So there is an ontological distinction here between the work done by enslaved people in the creation of literary work and the work done by elite peers of the enslaving class. And so with my remaining minutes, I want to suggest that we have one kind of clear, maybe not completely clear, but we have one, I think, pointed account of the subjectivity of being on the receiving end of this imposition of ontological distinction. And that's in the poet Phaedrus. So the poet Phaedrus was a freedman of the imperial household, writing in the time of Tiberius, probably. It has been suggested that he could not actually have been himself a formerly enslaved person, because so many of his retellings of Aesopic fables kind of articulate a sympathy with power and an enslaver ideology. I think that's a fundamentally misguided argument, not least because of how many formerly enslaved people, especially from the imperial household, were enslavers themselves and had a great deal of sympathy with the kind of extant power structure. But I'm not interested so much in the content of Phaedrus's Aesopic tales here as I am in his self-representation as an author. And so for this, I'm just focusing on what he says in the prefaces to his 5 books of poetry. In the beginning of his first book, he says, well, Aesop is the author, the auctor. He came up with some materia, and I worked it up into these scenarios verses. And you know, materia is raw material. It's wood, unworked wood. I think this is conjuring clearly the image of the elite enslaver author who's maybe jotting down bullet points for a speech or a letter and handing it to a secretary to work it up, to polish it up. So at the beginning of his book of poetry, Phaedrus is really constructing himself in the role of an enslaved secretary or a formerly enslaved secretary relative to Aesop, who is the auctor, the enslaver and the author. Over the course of books 2 and 3, he starts to stretch against this a little bit. He starts sort of referring to the name of the author, I think, sarcastically, and speaking more assertively in the first person about what he himself can do with this poetry. By the time we get to book 3, he's talking about these as the books of Phaedrus, first and foremost. And he has a dedicatee, a patronal dedicatee, whom he talks to. Now he's just using the pen, the stylus of Aesop to write these poems. So Aesop recedes into the background. Phaedrus comes more into the fore. By book 4, he's really interested in the fact that he, as an author, has a unique perspective, that he can articulate something distinct that is nothing to do with the kind of raw material he's inherited. And the preface to book 5, it's too long to translate here, but he basically says, listen, I paid my debt to Aesop. If I'm still saying that this is Aesopic work, it's just to get you to pay attention to it. This is the poetry of Phaedrus. And I think that, I mean, you know, Latin poetry in this time period is really characterized by this kind of self-fashioning and self-regard on the part of poets, often using the materiality of books and the logistics of bookmaking and book writing to do that work. Think Catullus, think Ovid, etc. And what I want to suggest is that Phaedrus is articulating in his poetic prefaces a journey through these ontological distinctions, representing himself as a poet who begins as understanding himself as subject to this hard binary. And he represents his experience as an author as being essentially redefining himself and pushing against an ontological distinction imposed on him. And this is a distinction that's crucial when it comes to literary secretaries and vilici, because there's no other part of elite intellectual authorial work where the enslaved person is more of a direct proxy for the will and intent and persona of the enslaver than in secretarial work, right? So I think that what Phaedrus shows himself pushing against here is a weight and a resistance characterized in large part by the anxieties of the vilicus, of the overseer that I've been talking about earlier. I have some nascent thoughts on how this relates to labor conditions in the academy, as we've been encouraged to think about, but I see I'm at time. So I'm going to stop here and take your questions. Thank you.